Thank you very much, and good morning, young people. You have a big job in front of you. As you have been told, the young people in this country voted 2-1 for Barack Obama without really knowing anything about him, except he's offering hope and change. I hope you want something more specific for your goals in life other than hope and change. Really, the title of my talk is Find Your Place in the Conservative Movement. And there is a place for you. Are you all out of college? What is the age group that I'm talking to? You're all...
We have a handful of people still in college.
You have a few people still in college learning all the wrong things, so we will try to correct some of those things today. But you do have a place, and I think it is exciting working in the conservative movement. I've been a volunteer in the conservative movement all my life. I work without a salary from anything I'm associated with. I'm not suggesting that you can plan your life to work without an income, but I am telling you it's enough fun that it would be worth working without a salary, because building the conservative movement can be fun. It's also extremely important. It's matters about the kind of country you're going to live in. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself to see how I got into it and why I'm still into it. I grew up during the Great Depression that you've only heard about, and I know that young people have so many problems and challenges today. In those years, we only had one problem. It was money. We didn't have any of these other sex and other problems that you all have. And so my parents gave me the desire for a college education, but no money to pay for it. And I went to work on my 18th birthday in the largest ammunition plant in the world. And I spent my college years working the night shift in an ammunition plant, testing 30 and 50 caliber ammunition before it was accepted by the government. Half the time I worked 4 to midnight, and the other half midnight to 8 in the morning, and then went to college in the morning. Graduated in 3 years, and I really don't understand what young people do in college these days, because I was able to work a 48-hour week and still get through in 3 years. So that's the way it was. And then I went to saved enough money and went to Harvard and got my master's. And you know, people, young women are told today, you know, what victims women are in America, and how the world only started with the feminist movement. Oh, no. My mother got her bachelor's and a graduate degree in 1920 from a great university. Women could do it then. I got my bachelor's in 44. When I went to Harvard, the graduate school was fully co-ed, got my master's then. And then I went at the beginning of American Enterprise Association, which then was just a little tiny couple of offices in downtown Washington. But anyway, I then, after a few years of doing research in politics and economics, I got married and settled down in a little town on the Mississippi River called Alton. And politics was my hobby. I enjoyed keeping up on it and joining a women's Republican club and trying to help a few candidates and so forth. And then in 1952, which everybody knew was going to be a big Republican year, that was the year Eisenhower was elected, the party came and tried to get my husband to run for Congress, and he was supporting a family. He didn't need that. And somebody said, why don't you run? So you have to take your opportunities when they come. Here I am, 26 years old with a 1.5-year-old baby. And okay, fine, I'll run for Congress. And running was simpler in those days. I ran a spirited campaign, won the primary, but I was in a heavily Democratic district and didn't win in November. But I kept my interest in Republican national conventions and Republican activities. And in those days, the Republican Party was really what you would think about today as almost right-wing conservative. The typical Midwestern Republican was a real, honest-to-goodness, authentic conservative. And these were the days when we were concerned about the Soviet missile threat and the communist infiltration. And I want to tell you that the conservative movement was really built in this country with small study groups about communism. And I developed a 10-lesson plan based on 10 congressional committee documents about communism and laid out the plan, how you get a little group together and you get people together to read this one document and then discuss it. And I repackaged this same program for 3 organizations I was connected with. One was the Illinois Federation of Republican Women. One was the Cardinal Mindszenty Foundation, which was a Catholic anti-communist organization, and the other was the DAR. And at one time we had, we think, 5,000 of these study groups. Now, this is pre-internet, pre-fax machine. Telephone calls were expensive. There were only a couple of conservative publishers. I would say only maybe 4 or 5 conservative books published every year. These groups had no contact with one another, and but they were educating themselves. We had an educated grassroots who knew the evils of communism. When Ronald Reagan ultimately called it the evil empire, we knew it was the evil empire because the grassroots were educated. Well, anyway, we had all these little independent groups without any contact with each other, and then all of a sudden Barry Goldwater appeared, and they all fell in line and started to march. We believed he was an authentic conservative. And I had been monitoring Republican national conventions. So I realized that most of the delegates to a Republican National Convention are people who've never been to one before. I would say that is true every time. The majority have never been to one before. And they needed to know how those Northeastern liberal Republicans, the people we now call the rhinos, Republican in name only, or country club Republicans, or Me Too Republicans, had dictated their choice against what the grassroots wanted. And I belonged to the group that wanted Barry Goldwater. So that's when I wrote my first little book, A Choice Not an Echo. Well, now here I am, a housewife in a little town in Illinois, never had published anything, just gone to Republican meetings and maintained my knowledge and interest in politics. So who's going to publish me? Nobody. So I published it myself and invested in 25,000 copies of this. And then when they arrived in my garage, I went down the basement. I had my own little mimeograph machine. In those days, you put it, cut a stencil on your old-fashioned manual typewriter, and then I went down in the basement in an old-fashioned mimeograph machine. I ground out 200 letters and sent them to people around the country and said, buy this book and send it to your delegate going to the Republican convention. This was in April. I sold 3 million copies. And every week I meet public officials who say, Phyllis, I came into the conservative movement reading A Choice Not an Echo in 1964. Now, what it was, it told the history of Republican National Conventions. And most political writing is just to rev up your prejudices. That wasn't what my writing was. My writing really persuaded people. It took people who were supporting Lyndon Johnson and got them to support Barry Goldwater, and people who were supporting Nelson Rockefeller, who was the big boogeyman of the time, New York, country club, rhino, and converted them to be for Barry Goldwater. So of course, we had a devastating defeat when Lyndon Johnson won, but 27 million people voted for Barry Goldwater. Nobody ever regretted it. And that was the start of the conservative movement. And so in spite of that devastating defeat, we didn't give up hope. But I'll tell you the mindset of conservatives in those days was, we'll never be able to elect a real conservative president. And but we're going to keep passing out our literature. We're going to keep having our study groups and educating ourselves. And that's the mindset that gave us Richard Nixon. We got convinced he was the best we could do, and he was a big disappointment. But in 1967, I started my newsletter because by this time I had a lot of people around the country who were writing me about politics. And it's now in its 42nd year. It looks just the same. And I would take an issue each month and write about it and research it and give you my thoughts. And in February of 1972, I wrote one called What's Wrong with Equal Rights for Women? And this was the constitutional amendment that had just come out of Congress. And that newsletter kind of took off into orbit. I mean, all of a sudden, people around the country would call me and say, Phyllis, I took your newsletter to my state legislature, and they voted down ERA. And I realized I had something. So I decided we needed to organize to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. And I'm not going to take time this morning to tell you everything that's wrong with it. Ultimately, I wrote nearly 100 newsletters on it. It was a fascinating subject to deal with. Now, I want to tell you, I was not a leader. I grew up very shy. I did my little thing, but I was not a people person, and I was not a leader. And I'm telling you that because I'm telling you, not all leaders are born. Leaders can be made. You can make yourself a leader. And that's what I did. And now there are all kinds of people who like to see me as a leader, but it was hard work over many years. But you can make yourself into a leader. And we do need leaders like you in the conservative movement who have the courage of your convictions and who you can get other people to come along and join you in a project. Well, anyway, I invited 100 women from 30 states who basically were fans of A Choice Not an Echo to come to St. Louis, and we met there. And then I put them on a bus and took them down to the riverfront and took them on the Showboat, where you have all these showboat musicals like Showboat and Jerome Kern and so forth. I climbed up on the stage and I challenged them to become leaders and go home and start a movement to stop ERA. And we didn't have any men in the group then, but I had one of my women who sing my favorite song, Stout-Hearted Men. And you know the line in that song is, and the strong obey when a strong man shows them the way. And so that was our theme. We're going out to do it. Now, when we got started, they needed 38 states to ratify the amendment. And basically, they had 30 before we got started. They not only had 30 states, they had the momentum, they had 99% of the media, they had the good name. I mean, how can you be against equal rights? And all of the organizations had plenty of money. And we took them all on, and to make a long story short, in a 10-year battle, we beat them all. And it's a wonderful example of how grassroots can beat all the powers that be, because everybody was against us. And we didn't have any big names. And but we worked out a strategy, and we told the truth. I would say maybe the biggest element was that I chose the battleground we fight on. And the battleground we fought on was the legal rights that women would lose if ERA passed. As one example, remember in 1972, we're just coming out of the Vietnam War. The draft was a big thing. I had sons and daughters around 18 or 20 then. My daughters thought this is the dumbest thing they ever heard. You're going to put women in the Constitution, and the first thing is we have to sign up for the draft like our brothers? You got to be kidding. Because the draft law, the draft registration law, is your classic example of a sex discriminatory law. It says male citizens of age 18 must register. And so anyway, I forced my opponents into waging a defensive game. Their whole game plan was to attack me, and they'd come into these hearings. Phyllis Schlafly says yakety yak, and it isn't so. Well, you know, they never went over the 50-yard line. And I testified in 41 state legislative hearings, and they were never able to show any benefit. There's absolutely no benefit. So we beat them, and they've never forgiven me for it. So So that's the way it is. So I hope that the young women in this group won't be misled by the feminist movement, which is still around and doing all kinds of damage. Now, the principal thing that's wrong with the feminist movement is they preach a line of victimology. American women are victims of an oppressive patriarchy in this country, and they've been unjustly treated. You can't believe how many times I went to testify, and my opponent are engaging in debates, and my opponent is crying around about women not having the right to vote. Now, that was in 1920 that women got the right to vote. I don't even know anybody who remembers that, but they're still crying around about it. And I did a column recently about why Hillary Clinton didn't get the nomination. Basically, she's a feminist, and they're all complaining she was the victim of sexism. And it wasn't because she was a woman that the Democrats ditched her. It was because she's so unlikable. And the women and the men just didn't like her. And to win in politics, you got to be somewhat likable, and she wasn't. And you see the difference between Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin. Now, the media and other people have really been very unfair to her. They've attacked her for all kinds of things, but she's not whining. And people don't want to hear you whining about oppression and unjust treatment, even if it is unjust. There's sin in the world. We know people do bad things, but get over it. If you wake up in the morning with the chip on your shoulder, you're not going to accomplish anything, whether you're a man or a woman. And of course, I tell the guys, you got to be careful when you date a girl or think about marrying one, because if she looks like Bella Abzug, you will recognize a feminist. But they don't all. Sometimes they're pretty, and you might be misled. And so a good way to find out is ask her how she feels about Phyllis Schlafly, and then you will know. But you don't. The feminists are, I think, the biggest threat to the institution of marriage today. When they talk about liberation, that's what they mean. Liberation from home, husband, family, and children. They initiate 80% of the divorces in this country. They've learned how to cast off their husband or their boyfriend and get custody of the children, and then make him pay for it and live without any obligations of marriage. That's their idea. 80% of the people getting same-sex marriage licenses in Massachusetts are lesbians. There's not a whole lot of benefit in a couple of men getting the marriage license, but the women can do it, and they see a benefit in that because what they want to do is create a matriarchy. These mother-headed, feminist-headed households. So you've got to look out for it, and it's very difficult to reform a feminist, although I do get about one letter a week of some woman who says she was protesting against me 30 years ago, but now she's realized I was right. But at any rate, these are some of the things out there, and another thing you have to look out for is the way the educational system has changed. Now, Obama's good buddy is this professor of education, Bill Ayers, at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he is a principal advocate of what they call social justice teaching. Now that doesn't have anything to do with social justice. This is this idea that America is an unjust and oppressive society, and that it is up to people to organize in order to overthrow the status quo, spread the wealth around, and take power. That's what they are teaching. They get it from the Rules for Radicals, written by Saul Alinsky. And really, you ought to read that book. It was written by this radical organizer in Chicago a couple of decades ago. I reread it while I was standing in line to vote the other day. And it's a short book, but it lays out the whole plan of Obama's life and the plan of Bill Ayer's life and what they are doing. And if you, I do track the curriculum in the public schools, and they're teaching a global education. It's an attack on patriotism. It's trying to make people believe in multiculturalism, which really means all cultures are equal, but America is the worst. And diversity, which is usually a code word for the gay rights agenda, but it can also mean other kinds of diversity too. This whole attack on American sovereignty and patriotism, and it's coming from all levels. I don't know if you noticed the speeches of the British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. We all think of the English as our friends. He came to Harvard last year, it wasn't even that long ago, earlier this year, and made a speech in which he called for a declaration of interdependence, and which is basically telling us we should repeal our Declaration of Independence. And he just used the words global and globalism and New World Order and multiculturalism and global networks and global obligations, just hundreds of times in this one speech. And he must have thought it was a good speech because he basically gave it again just last week to a British crowd. And so when you travel around the rest of the world, you will find that America is so precious. It is so wonderful. And it is so different from whatever's in second place that there isn't any comparison. We have something so wonderful in this country. And I just hope you will be able to live in the land of freedom and opportunity that some of the rest of us old folks have grown up in. It's just so different that was given to us by our founding fathers, with the opportunity for you to achieve whatever you can achieve as a result of hard work and perseverance, not as a result of organizing to demand that you take wealth and power away from other people who've done their hard work in order to build up whatever they've got. So there are all kinds of places. Now, I realize you all probably don't read newspapers. You get your information off the internet. I invite you to come to eagleforum.org. It is a goldmine of information on all these subjects. I not only write this every month, I write a column every week. It's usually on WorldNet Daily and Town Hall and Human Events, but you can get it on my website. There's an enormous goldmine of information that you can use in all sorts of ways on different subjects. And I urge you to make use of it. I've filed amicus briefs in many of the important cases up before the court. And we do not have a conservative court yet. I think the issue of the Supreme Court is maybe the biggest issue facing our country. I urge you to get my book, The Supremacist. It's an easy read. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand it. It is my belief that most of the problems we face started with a bad decision of the Earl Warren Supreme Court. Now, it's very interesting when McCain and Obama did that Saddleback interview, and they asked Obama who were his favorite Supreme Court justices, and he first named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Well, she is a #1 feminist, and he's toting to the feminists who have a death grip around the top levels of the Democratic Party. She was an ACLU lawyer in behalf of feminism. And then he named Earl Warren. Now, I need to tell you about Earl Warren because it was the Earl Warren Court that gave us most of the problems we have. Oh, it was the start of all the anti-religion cases, which have just grown in a tremendous stream of what Bob Bork calls the hostility to religion of the courts. It was the Warren Court that gave us Roe v. Wade, the anti-life. It was the Warren Court that started the anti-property rights cases that we have still not been able to get rid of because of the Kelo decision a couple of years ago. The bad decisions in regard to politics, to taxes, to crime, to immigration, they all started with the Warren Court. Now, Then you can go on YouTube. Oh, it's so wonderful, the things you can get on the internet. They've got an interview that Obama gave in 2001 to a Chicago radio station where he said, I was asked about the court, and he said, well, the Warren court didn't go far enough. All they did was change the law. They didn't change the economics. They didn't spread the wealth around. They didn't organize transfers of money and wealth. So you see where he's going. Now, if I haven't convinced you how much you're needed and your work in the conservative movement, I don't know what it would be, because you are so needed. Now, my son Andy has started this thing called Conservapedia. Now, he thinks that Wikipedia has been really dominated by a lot of left-wingers. They distort a lot of things, and he has started Conservapedia. You can go on, and this type of work on the internet is you can write your own things and put it on. I'm sure you're all smart about a lot of subjects, and you can add things to it and get information from it. And there's so much out there on the internet. Of course, there's a lot of trash on the internet too, but you want to make sure the good things are out there and that you can find them and distribute them. And we're depending on your generation to do this. Obama has just made he's moved politics into a whole new level of activating technology to reach the young people in this country. It's incredible what his smart people have done. And I guess the Republican National Committee and the McCain campaign were not smart enough to do likewise. But you're the smart ones. You've got to get out there and give us access to all of the information about that we need to know. One of our board members here said that she had 2 children who were age 18 and 21. And she said 6 Obama people came to their door to try to recruit those 2 kids to vote for Obama, in addition to about 10 telephone calls. And this is a grassroots organization that is on a level that the conservatives have never done. We need you to activate the conservative level. Is that Karen out there? Oh, hi, Karen. I just spotted you. Well, now, Karen is one of our young women who has exercised leadership. And what she did was to start clubs of conservative women on college campus. That's really something. That's not easy. And she's got now a network of a dozen of these clubs on a dozen college campuses. And that's a great way to go. It's called, her organization is a takeoff on NOW. It's called NEW, and that stands for Network of Enlightened Women. And you are the enlightened ones, and we need you to utilize all of these techniques. And if you're out of college, maybe find a younger brother or sister who can activate the college campuses and educate them and give them a way to socialize and reinforce each other in working for the conservative movement. Specialize in something so that you can find your place and make an impact, because every one of you can do it. If I could do it, if Karen can do it, you all can do it too. Now I'm going to stop and take questions. Well,
Till lunch.
yeah, till lunch.
Excellent. So we've got a lot of time. I'm going to start with the first question, if that's all right. I wonder if you would try to contrast two of the biggest figures when it comes to imaging, branding, and communication over the last 20 years. Contrast the rise of Reagan and the rise of Obama in terms of one, espousing conservative principle, the other espousing radical, and both of them became mainstream to some degree.
You mean how they did it?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly the image and the branding and the communication had a big.
Well, Reagan was good at television, and that was great. So when they put him on television to make fun of him or try to catch him in saying something dumb, he was better than they were. So he really came across. But I will tell you, in those years, now I'm talking about 1978, 79, in the conservative movement, the conservatives suffered from a psychology of defeat. We were sure we were going to lose. We were going to do our part, but we had no vision of victory. And that is why it's so important that we did proclaim victory in the Equal Rights Amendment. This was new to the conservative movement. We were so used to being beaten down and losing. And I remember the night in 1980 when Reagan won. We're all in a state of shock. He actually won. Okay, and then he went on to double it. I would say the fact that he was good at presenting himself. He was likable, as you know. He also was really smart. He did not get credit for that. But we now know this due to the work of a black female historian who probably, I'm guessing, got a special privilege to go into the dark rooms at the Reagan Center, and she discovered this box that nobody had ever been in before, where he had handwritten all his radio broadcasts on yellow pad. In the olden days, we used to write everything out on yellow pad, longhand. And all of his, he did for several years, he did radio broadcasts, just like the ones I do, five days a week. And he was a one-man think tank. He was well-read. He didn't have any secretary or researchers, and he wrote them himself. So he knew the issues. So in his inside, he understood the way to go. And I'll tell you a little story that was told to me very authentically. When he went into office, the big issue was, we were in kind of an economic recession. They called it stagflation because everything was wrong. And the big question was he going to cut taxes or not? And his own people were very divided. And they made their case, and he had to make the decision. And I'm told by somebody who was there that this is what he said. Well, he said, when I was making movies, we were making a lot of movies, and the tax rates were up to 70% then. And he said, by the end of February, my accountants told me there was no point in working anymore because I wouldn't be able to keep any of my money. So he said, I quit working, and I hung around the Brown Derby, that's kind of a pub in Hollywood. And he said, I drank too much. And he said, that's when my wife left me. And he said, I'm not going to do anything that discourages people from working. We cut taxes, and people will have the incentive to work. Now that just tells you a lot about the guy, and about the importance of lower taxes being an incentive to people to work. You can keep what you make. Now Obama really, well, of course, I think the Democrats really didn't want Hillary. I think they were just glad to dump her, and they looked around, and he seemed to be the only thing available to replace her with, but then he had very clever organizers. This David Axelrod is apparently a very clever strategist, and he had the Saul Alinsky community organizing techniques, and he apparently had just extremely expert technology people that are beyond what the Republicans have, and then he had money. And enormous amount of money. And we still don't know how much of it may have come from overseas illegally. Nobody's able to find that out. You understand why that is. In the contributions, political contributions, you don't have to report who it is if it's up to $199. And then if it's on a credit card, there's no way of tracing it. And just tens of millions of dollars came in like that. That was too long an answer. I'll try to keep them shorter.
There's going to be a lot for us to stand up against in these next 4 years. What should we really be focusing on as young people, and what should we really be the most kind of rallying behind the most that Obama might try to sneak through?
Well, Obama's going to come forth with all kinds of bad plans, and you would be very helpful in any type of outreach on the internet, on YouTube, with your congressman, of some of his initial bad ideas, like the card check, which is getting rid of the secret ballot for the unions, the hate crimes. Who knows what he's going to come up with? They're all bad ideas. So you can do that. But I really do urge that you get together in little study groups, so that you are discussing this, so you're developing your ability to talk about the issues, and so that you're really informed. I have a study group manual that will give you enough to talk about for 8 different subjects: the sovereignty issues, the immigration issues, the life issues, et cetera, et cetera. You can get that and use that for a manual. Or you, if you want to approach the court issue, I have another study guide that uses this as a text, so you can have one on the God issues like Pledge and 10 Commandments and Boy Scouts, and one on the life issues, one on the property issues, and so forth, and see how the courts are doing so much damage. I feel that the grassroots are simply not adequately educated and informed. And I do favor these small groups where you get together and then you learn how to express yourself and talk about these issues.
What would you say, feeding off Karen's question, the balance between being against certain things and for certain things? It seems to me that as conservatives in this cycle and cycles prior, we've largely been on defense. We haven't been on offense. And getting back to, as someone mentioned earlier, first principles, there's now a movement, Rebuild the Party, rebuildtheparty.com, and getting back to what are our core beliefs and how we strayed from them. What would you advise us as far as keeping that balance of being against things versus being for things and having a positive message and redefining that for the public?
Well, I think it's very important to be against bad things. And sometimes that is a bigger motivator than being for something. And of course, when I fought the Equal Rights Amendment, I was against something. I wasn't offering an alternative, and I was showing all the bad things that would happen. So I think you can build your strength being against bad things, and I do believe there'll be a lot of bad things to be against with Obama's plan. I think the conservative movement should be a separate entity from the Republican Party. But I do think the conservatives should make it one of their goals to retake the Republican Party. And apparently George Bush turned out not to be a conservative. And we need to retake it. And we did take it in 1964. We took it again in 1980. And we took it really again in 1994. And I think the Republican Party is the only vehicle to achieve our goals. Now, if you all want to get in politics, make friends with a congressman or a senator or a state legislator. It's very helpful if you can call up one and call him by his first name and tell him you want him to vote yes or no on something. That's a very good thing to do. I've heard a congressman say, Congressman's staff tell me that their congressman votes for whoever he gets the calls from the day of the vote. Okay? So there are all kinds of people. So you need to be part of the process.
Other questions? Mike.
Ma'am, what opportunities do you see in the next 2 years for conservatives?
What opportunities? Well, the big opportunity of preventing Obama's agenda from passing. Now just use as an example our defeat of the Hillary health plan. Now, when we started out on that, and the Eagle Forum played a major role in that, nobody thought we could win. I have to tell you, most of the battles I've fought, people were telling me at the beginning, it's hopeless. And in fact, even Bob Dole was making a deal with the Hillary people. Nobody thought we could beat it. And we not only beat it, it was responsible for electing the Republican majority in 1994. When I took on the ERA ballot, nobody thought. I mean, this is Phyllis's little plaything. Nobody thought we could win, right down to the very end. And I'll tell you another one that is I think, very significant was the defeat was getting Bush to withdraw Harriet Miers. That was a very significant event in the conservative movement. Bush really insulted us by naming this unqualified feminist woman who had nothing to recommend her except she was a friend of George Bush. And when we said she won't do, everybody said, oh, Bush is stubborn. You'll never get him to change his mind. Well, we did. And the result is we got a very good Justice Sam Alito. And so you can take on difficult tasks, and it is very important to be against bad things. And I guess we're going to have a big opportunity to be against bad things in the next couple of years. But we also have to think about building up leaders. And that is more difficult. A reporter called me a few months ago and said, oh, Mrs. Schlafly, since George W. Bush went in the White House, you all have known that Dick Cheney would not be your next nominee. What have you guys been doing for the last 8 years? And that's a very good question. We weren't building up anybody. And I'm not convinced that any of the other 10 aspirants for a Republican nomination would have done any better than John McCain. So we need to build up leaders. And we want to find them and train them and give them the experience of facing hostile reporters and so forth.
And why do you think that is? I mean, after having the model of Reagan and essentially since '88, about 20 years, we've, as you mentioned, been in a situation where we had 8 years to plan for a replacement, and it wasn't really anybody to look to. I mean, we've recently have Jindal and Palin and a few others to look to as potential leaders. Fundamentally, is there a single cause as to why there wouldn't have been a stream of leaders coming out of the conservative movement?
Well, the biggest cause is we don't have more Republican governors. And that's really kind of where you look with Republican governors. And there are possibilities out there. I think Sarah Palin was a great asset to the ticket. She invigorated the movement, and she's wonderful and everything else. However, she does need education. For example, just this week, I saw a letter that she wrote endorsing the Law of the Sea Treaty. Now, the Law of the Sea Treaty is something we do not want. It is a great attack on American sovereignty, might even allow the UN to impose taxes on us. So we need to get our potential leaders well trained. You need to have contact with them. One of the problems with McCain is I don't know who was on his staff, but I didn't know anybody. And many people believe personnel is policy, and you need to have contacts with these people. To cut your teeth in politics, working for an election of a state rep is a good way to get started. You learn a lot. I told you I grew up shy, and for years it was easier for me to talk to 1,000 people than it was to talk to 20 people in a room like this and take questions. But I ran for Congress in 1972, and basically it was a coffee party campaign. I had 2 coffee parties in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 1 in the evening. And the plan was they'd have a certain time, they'd have their coffee and cookies for 15 minutes, I would talk for 15 minutes, and then I would take questions for 30 minutes. I lost narrowly. It was a race that could have been won if the Republicans had had a good year. And it took me a little while to get over it. But after a couple of years, I was glad I lost, because that's when I took on the ERA fight. But after a couple more years, I was glad I ran and lost, because I learned so much in doing that. And that's what completed my own education of being able to talk to people like you and not being scared of what question you're going to ask, or being able to cope with, and I've coped with plenty of hostile questions too. And so running for office and talking to people is certainly a big element in your education and making you into leaders. Every one of you in this room can be a leader in your area. If I can do it, you can do it. Yeah.
Recently, I was talking with a friend of mine about how he voted for Obama. He's a conservative, hardcore conservative. He voted for Obama because he only agreed with McCain on like 60% of the issues. And just hardcore, he's in the political movement. I'm not going to name the organization or anything. But I'm wondering if we've gotten to a point where we have set the hardcore, like that 11% that didn't show up for the election, that didn't vote for McCain and gave it to Obama. I'm wondering if we've set ourselves up to a point where our standards are so high that if Ronald Reagan were running today, that he would be too liberal for us, or he would not be the candidate for us. I think I'm hearing a lot of that from conservatives.
Well, yes, and I think they're very much mistaken. I will tell you, there were some of us in 1980 who did think Ronald Reagan was too liberal. That's why we started out supporting Phil Crane, but we soon thought better of our decision. Nobody's going to be perfect, and let me tell you, we are not going to have a resurrection of Ronald Reagan. That isn't going to happen, okay? And I just think a lot of conservatives have been really expecting that. And it isn't going to happen. So we have to play with the cards we have. And I certainly voted for McCain because you can ask your friend in 4 years if his vote was worth it. Because I do think the power of the presidency has grown so much that so much damage can be done in 4 years. But I think we need to develop more leaders in Congress and the Senate. And there are a few good people who need to be given, well, not so much backbone, but more visibility. And they're good people. And maybe 30 of them in the House, maybe a couple in the Senate, and we need to encourage them. I think it was a great mistake to say, I'm going to sit this one out. But you look at the vote in Ohio, which is a crucial state. Obama didn't get any more votes in Ohio than Kerry got 4 years ago. But the Republican fall-off was 300,000. 300,000 fewer people voted Republican. And that's why Obama carried Ohio. And I think that's a great mistake. The people who decided to sit it out because they didn't like McCain. Of course, I think there are a lot of problems with McCain. But one thing you do know, he's for the United States of America. And I'm not sure about the other guy.
And that point too, I think I've heard Santorum say before about that a lot of times we sacrifice the good in trying to get the perfect.
Yeah, we're not going to get the perfect. It's I don't see a Ronald Reagan out there, but when he started out, a lot of people didn't see that he could make it either. So, but he was built into a leader, and a great leader, greatest president of the 20th century. I hope you will all get the Phyllis Schlafly report. It costs $20 a year. If you haven't got $20, you can get it free on www.eagleforum.org, in addition to everything else. And there are all kinds of good information that you need, that you can talk about. You could build a study group about my reports every month or my columns every week, and discuss these issues so that you've got the facts and can be eloquent spokesman for the conservative movement. You're the ones who've got to save the country, and where better than you all right here? And yeah.
No pressure at all. Well, with that, I think that's a perfect rallying cry for us. We're the ones that got to carry on the torch that
You certainly do.
she's been caring for us for a long time. So I think it's a testament when a strong, eloquent, powerful female voice is heard. It's hard to ignore. So Phyllis, thank you very much for doing this.